Hello, so in this video I'm going to talk through topic 2 of OCR A-level Sociology of Youth, which is focused on youth deviance. So I'm going to run through the key perspectives and the key concepts and give some evaluation for each. Okay, so to begin with, for the youth deviance, it's kind of classic functionalist explanation. So Merton's strain theory, so young people have to innovate to achieve the cultural goals because they can't access the institutionalized means. So working class youth, that would particularly apply for, and it explains working class youth crime. Similarly, Cohen with status frustration, this idea that working class youth may feel frustrated with their status in society and therefore commit crime, commit deviance, maybe join gangs to gain status. Miller talks about focal concerns, and this is the idea that working class youth have different priorities, different values to others in society. So the values themselves are inherently deviant, working class youth. So it's quite, just jump into the evaluation here. These things are quite deterministic. It's kind of almost saying if you are working class youth, you're pretty much predisposed to kind of criminality or deviance. I've put the new right in here as well, and that's the study by Murray talking about the underclass, which are kind of welfare dependent, just deviant almost by nature, and that's an explanation for youth deviance of this group that Murray calls the underclass. So that's functionalist explanations, and the new right tagged on there because they're all kind of in agreement about this. They agree about this kind of value consensus, but obviously there's some issues there. Mainly that they are pretty deterministic. Okay, moving on to Marxist, neo-Marxist explanations or explanations from the left. So you can talk about the CCCS here if you're talking about youth deviance. I've done another video on youth subcultures that you can look at where I talk about this in more detail, the CCCS. But CCCS, so Hall and Jefferson, Hebditch, Brake, Clark, etc., talk about youth subcultures, particularly spectacular youth subcultures, as a form of resistance by working class youth. And these youth subcultures, by being subcultures, are deviant. They're going against the grain, and therefore it explains youth deviance as an act of resistance. So you can use any of those in explaining youth deviance. Here I've also got left realism. So Lee and Young talking about relative deprivation, marginalization, and subculture. So again, this applies to working class youth who feel on the fringes of society, feel marginalized, and subculture is an opportunity to maybe make some money. So joining a gang, for example. In terms of evaluation, I think we could say, well, what about gender? What about ethnicity? Why is it that young men are overrepresented? Why is it that certain ethnic minorities are overrepresented? These explanations don't really talk about that. They're mainly focusing on class, as you would expect from Marxist, neo-Marxist, and left realist explanations. Okay. Moving on to interactionist explanations, so kind of classic interactionist explanations. We've got Becker's labeling theory, and linked to that, this idea of self-fulfilling prophecy, that it's not the act itself, it's the label that makes something deviant. And particularly for working class youth, they're often labeled by authorities as deviant, and that can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Adding on to that, Sickerell, the negotiation of justice, is this idea that the working class youth, it's much more likely that they are going to get in trouble with the police than, for example, middle class youth who can kind of talk their way out of it or appear to be, it's a minor kind of misdemeanor for a middle class youth, whereas for working class it's like, here we go again, they're causing trouble, there's nothing we can do, we have to just kind of lock them up. The evaluation for both of these is that they don't really explain the initial act. Why is it that people are committing those acts of deviance or crime in the first place? We have to use, Marxist or functionalist explanations maybe for those. I have done longer videos on all these different perspectives just when I'm talking about crime and deviance, which are coming up soon on the channel. So check those out when they are released. Okay, postmodernist explanations of youth deviance. So Katz, this idea of the seductions of crime, that crime can be kind of seductive. You get a kind of emotional thrill from crime. So for, youth getting involved in deviance. It could be that they're kind of seduced by the idea of crime. This is very much linked to Ling's concept of edge work. So crime is like risk taking. And if you think about young people, it links to kind of functionalist explanations of youth culture, that youth could be a place to test the boundaries. I think it was Eisenstadt talked about that, which is a functionalist idea. But you could link that to kind of Ling and this idea of edge work. It's a place to test the boundaries, a place to kind of take risks because you don't have as many responsibilities as adults do. However, these explanations don't really factor in class, ethnicity, or gender, which if you look at the statistics on youth deviance, obviously those things clearly do play a role. Okay, then if we're talking about class just generally, and for class, ethnicity, and gender, I've also included anti-school subcultures because they come under this topic. So Decker and Van Winkle talk about the pull of gangs for working class youth. You could link that to maybe the functionalist study by Cloward and Olin, the illegitimate opportunity structure. It's quite similar to that one. You could also maybe link that to Merton's strain theory or Cohen's status frustration, that gangs, offer this pull for working class youth. Harding adds on to this that gangs can be like a game of high stakes, a kind of street casino. It's likely you're going to lose and you're going to get in trouble, but if you succeed, the payoff is massive, which is why people kind of get involved. Moving on to anti-school subcultures, we've got the classic study from Willis, Learning to Labour, and which basically argues that working class anti-school subcultures were working class youth learning to labour. It was them getting ready for a role in kind of manufacturing or heavy industry kind of jobs where messing around, where having a laugh was kind of part of the culture. So they didn't see school as important to them, schooling and the school culture. For evaluation for all of these, I think we need to think about gender. Why is it that it was the lads that Willis looked at? Why is it that most gangs are kind of dominated by young men? So I think gender could come in as a factor. Okay, moving on to ethnicity and youth deviance. So there's lots of other things you could actually bring in here. I've talked about the studies that specifically talk about ethnicity, but you could talk about interactionism. You could talk about class-based explanations like left realism, for example, and link that to ethnicity, and in terms of ethnic minorities more likely to experience marginalization, for example. So the first study focusing just on ethnicity is Nightingale, and this was the study of young black males in Philadelphia in the USA, and Nightingale coins this concept of the paradox of inclusion. So for these young black males in Philadelphia, it's like strain theory. They wanted the goals of society. They wanted the same things they were being told to kind of, work for or try and buy, this consumerism, but they couldn't access them because of lack of opportunity, for example, in the education system and in the job market. So it's this paradox of inclusion. So they then turned to crime, and what did they buy with the money they made from crime? The things that society was telling them, the consumer products. So this idea of the paradox of inclusion. They wanted the American dream but couldn't access it through the traditional means. Then moving on to anti-school subcultures, Sewell's study of the cultural comfort zone, this idea that young black males, form kind of subcultures within schools because they want to be around people from similar background to them. Mack and Gale talks about in this book, Young, Gifted and Black, that subcultures can be a response to teacher racism. So again, it's like a kind of coping mechanism. This is similar to Mers's studies on strategic rationalization, and it was this study on young black female students who formed anti-school but pro-education subcultures as a response to teacher labeling. In terms of evaluation, I think we could talk about gender. What about gender? Gender is obviously a factor in lots of these things that maybe these studies primarily focused on ethnicity haven't maybe touched upon. Or you maybe need to bring in something else from gender to tell the whole picture. Okay, so now on to gender and explanations of youth deviance. So really the kind of two strands to it are overrepresentation of males due to social control in overrepresentation in terms of in youth deviance, And also masculinity. So is it that young women are committing less crime because they're not going out as much, they're not allowed to, or is it that young men have this desire to kind of assert this masculine identity? So a classic study to start with, McRobbie and Garber talking about bedroom culture, an example of kind of social control you could use to explain why young women are underrepresented in crime statistics. And then on the other hand, Messerschmitt, this idea that gangs are a place to do masculinity. So this explains why young men are overrepresented in crime statistics. In terms of anti-school subcultures, Blackman did a study on the New Wave girls, who this was an anti-school subculture who resisted gender stereotypes by, they were expected to try hard, expected to dress a certain way, expected to be polite, and the New Wave girls didn't do any of that. So it's a resistance to gender stereotypes. And then Jackson, another classic study here on the Ladettes, which was about young women taking on masculine traits. And Jackson really talks about this in terms of fear of failure. So for a lot of working class young women, it was this idea of messing around as a kind of excuse. Well, I didn't do well anyway. So it's this fear of, they didn't want to try hard and fail. It was easier to kind of mess around and fail and then say, well, I failed because I was messing around. So they are the kind of key studies on gender and youth deviance. But I just mentioned there with Jackson, class is a factor here. So that's something you could bring in as well. Okay, lastly, talking about the media and youth deviance. So absolute classic study to start with, Cohen, Folk Devils and Moral Panics, 1973, talking about media exaggeration of youth subcultures in the 1960s, the mods and rockers, and this created more deviance. More people went along with it. It created what Young called a deviancy amplification spiral. So Cohen really coins this phrase, moral panics. So the media over-exaggerating youth deviance. And we see this, throughout history, really. Forbert in 2008 talked about hoodies as a moral panic, and Blue Water Shopping Centre banned hoodies as if this item of clothing was making young people more deviant. And Brown talked about rave as a moral panic. In terms of evaluation, I think we have to think about, are moral panics useful? Do we still have moral panics? Are they outdated? So that's something definitely to think about. Okay, I hope that was useful running through those key perspectives and key studies. If you've got any comments or suggestions or queries, please leave a comment below. Thank you for listening.